I'm Caroline Hyde. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, the Singerman System Founders Fund partner and top-tier venture capitalist Brian Singerman joins us for a crash course on identifying big winners and the next big waves in tech. Plus, Silicon Valley's quiet unicorn unveils a new ad campaign, what Pinterest has in the pipeline to recapture public attention. And Apple sets its sights on deep space. We'll analyze the thinking behind poaching two of Google's top satellite executives. First to our lead, venture capital firm Founders Fund is best known for investing in companies building revolutionary technologies and for its somewhat controversial founder, Peter Thiel. The San Francisco-based firm has an impressive portfolio filled with tech titans like Facebook, SpaceX, Airbnb, Spotify. Founders Fund opened in 2005 with about $50 million in funds, and now it's on track to generate a whopping $9.5 billion in return. Joining us now is Founders Fund partner and top venture capitalist Brian Singerman. Also with us, guest host, friend of the show for the hour, you know him well, Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick, live in New York for us. And David, I'm going to get you asking some questions to Brian. But Brian, first of all, tell us a little bit about your ethos, your venture capital focus, because you're a man who really has started to up the game, getting in deeper and deeper into certain investments. I hear you're a bit of a gaming man yourself, and is that the tested rule?
Absolutely. So our strategy has always been invest in top-tier founders running strategically huge companies, regardless of sector, and go all in on the best ones. Put a huge amount of money behind our best companies, and that's been the secret to our success.
You went all in, notably with, well, perhaps you went in with Oculus. You then regretted not going as big a share as you could have done. But what an exit for you. Oculus being sold to Facebook. We know it was a $2 billion deal as it was announced and structured by Facebook. F8 took over some of the news this week. VR, AR, this is certainly an area that Facebook's getting into. How do you see virtual reality and augmented reality, the spectrum changing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Facebook is doing a fantastic job leading the charge for the next decade of communications. And they are playing the long game with the VR, AR, leading with both buying, obviously with Oculus, and developing new technologies. So I think you're going to see some exciting elements of communications, gaming, everything else, led by VR and AR over the next 10 years.
Brian, David Kirkpatrick here. Another thing I'd be curious to hear you talk about, given your track record, is the Internet of Things, which sort of encompasses more and more these days. Is that something that you think about in those terms, and how important do you see it to be?
Yeah, so we think about it in terms of how we think about everything. It's all about the micro company. We actually are very sector agnostic in that we don't think, oh, we need to invest in this specific sector. We think, oh, wow, this company is amazing. So if we saw an amazing company in the Internet of Things sector, we would absolutely go for it. But that's how we think of it more generally.
Thinking about amazing companies, or the lack thereof, I'm looking at my Bloomberg US Startup Barometer. This is a means by which we measure how sort of active, healthy the VC system is, the startup system is in the United States. We're measuring how much money is going into startups, the exits that we're seeing. What then to exits at the moment, and how you see the health of perhaps IPOs? I'm looking at you with an investment in Spotify, Founders Fund has. Do you want these companies to be coming to the market as soon as possible, or laying low?
Honestly, this is not a macro question. This really is a question that's independent for each individual company. At the board level, we discuss liquidity, financing, all aspects of that, whether to go public, stay private, and it's a really different decision for each company. So I don't think it has much to do with the macro environment, more to do with the individual companies.
What's fascinating about Spotify is, of course, talk that it wouldn't actually be raising more capital when it sold shares. It might feel that it would just be exiting, helping give money to its investors, helping cash in for those who founded it, but not raise new capital, just list. What's in it? Why do that?
I mean, Spotify has obviously clearly an independent strategy. Maybe a lot of its investors were saying, oh, we need liquidity. Maybe Spotify realized it didn't necessarily need the money for itself to run operations. Maybe it has plenty. Point being, this is a great example where there's not one right answer for every company, and Spotify chose the path that it thinks is the best for the company itself.
Brian, given you call it Founders Fund and you're so notoriously founder friendly, and another thing that's been a big part of the VC industry for a long time is this idea of investing in the person, not the idea. Is that sort of another way of saying what you do?
Absolutely. A huge part of our investment decision, whether it's at the early stage or the late stage, is based on the founding team, based on the management team. It's really important for us to have founders that are both strategically long-term visionaries as well as very execution-oriented. It doesn't make sense to have one part without the other, and when we find those two elements in a team that's doing something that we think is important for the world, we tend to make the investment.
What sort of funding rounds do you want to get in on? Are you looking at earlier and earlier stages? We're seeing a plethora of seed funds coming in. How is the battle going for when you find the company and how large a ticket you're putting in?
Yeah, honestly, we are totally stage agnostic in the same way that we're sector agnostic. I have no FOMO, fear of missing out as an investor. When we see that a company has developed a strategic moat and it's well on its way to being one of the most important companies on the planet, we go all in. That can be at the early stage, that might be at the later stage. Point being, we have the fund structure set up that we can account for all of those.
And David, do you want to have a quick last question?
Well, I do, because I wonder, how do you identify those strategic moats? You've obviously been really good at it, and you've doubled down on a number of companies, including that health company. I forget the name of it.
Stemcentrx, yep.
Yeah, one you made a ton of money on. How do you, that's the kind of thing everybody could say, but you seem to do it. Is there any secret sauce in that for you?
Well, I can't give away all of our secrets, or else I would be out of a job. But honestly, we really do try and answer the question, can this be cloned at this point? And if the answer is no, and it's got a phenomenal management team, we're going to go all in. But it's a really important question for us to figure out, can this be cloned at this point?
And my last question about the sort of overall ecosystem is the more and more big ticket money is coming in from later stage investors, from institutional money. Mm-hmm. How is this making your life more difficult? Or is it in some ways putting off big companies that potentially should go public going public, or does it not matter in your case?
Honestly, I still think this is a very company by company basis. Our job, right, is to find the world's most important companies and invest in them. It doesn't necessarily have to be early, but we have to invest in them at some point. And so regardless of what the funding landscape looks outside, that's what we're looking to do. And so I don't think it changes, fortunately, our job that much.
Fascinating stuff. We're going to be digging in so much more into some of the intricacies of healthcare tech, and that's a big area that you've made money and looking to make yet more. Brian Singerman, Founders Fund partner, and of course David Kirkpatrick, Techonomy CEO, joining us live from New York, and both sticking with me. Now, Uber has extended its internal investigation into sexual harassment claims at the company. That's according to Recode. The investigation, led by former US Attorney General Eric Holder, was sparked by charges of sexual harassment as well as a wider cultural problem at the ride-hailing giant. According to the media report, Holder has asked the board for an additional month to complete his inquiry and is yet to conduct interviews with several key figures in the investigation, including top HR execs. Now, a reminder that all episodes of Bloomberg Technology are now live streaming on Twitter. Check us out, why don't you, at Bloomberg Tech TV, weekdays at 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg. Now, we're back with Brian Singerman, partner at Peter Thiel's Founders Fund. We've talked about the top tech titans in the firm's portfolio, but Brian is also heavily invested in the healthcare sector. Collective Health, Counsel, Stemcentrx, and Oscar Health, all in the Founders Fund portfolio, and many of those portfolio companies that you have particularly made a beeline for. I mean, your real case in point of why you're on the Midas list, of course, is Stemcentrx, sold to AbbVie, $10 billion. You went all in this particular company. What do you think about M&A at the moment, and indeed the healthcare sector in general, valuation-wise? Because we're seeing a third less M&A, we're seeing far less ETF trading when it comes to healthcare because of what the Trump administration means. Are you still bullish on the healthcare sector and biotech?
So I'm bullish on individual companies. As I was pointing out, it's all about the specific company. So in Stemcentrx's case, regardless of what's going on in the biotech sector, that was going to be a special company. And we recognized that that was a special company, and therefore we went all in. When it comes to M&A or going public, that was definitely a strategic conversation we had at the board levels at Stemcentrx when AbbVie came around, and we think we got a great outcome there. But it was definitely a conversation of whether to go public or get acquired.
What, with that sort of example and others, does it tend to be? Is it that you can see the synergies so clearly? A bigger player teaming up with them would mean that their drugs that help against cancer would just get to market that much faster?
Sure. There's always advantages and disadvantages of each. I mean, AbbVie obviously has a fantastic distribution platform that's very powerful if you want to get these drugs into the hands of people that really need them. There's also advantages of staying independent, and we determined that at that time it was the right move to sell to AbbVie.
Looking at Oscar Healthcare is a fascinating one, not only because of what they're actually doing in terms of humanizing healthcare, making sure that also it's a cheaper way of insurance, which is so much in the prominence of the news, but also by who it's led by, co-founder, of course, brother to Jared Kushner. He's called Josh Kushner. How much are you looking at Oscar's health of itself at the moment? Because there's been worries about it losses.
Yeah, so we are extremely bullish on Oscar right now. Oscar is charged with fundamentally fixing the health insurance industry, and therefore the state of health in America through transparency. Like, you probably have little to no or negative relationship with your health insurer right now. Oscar is trying to change that. It's also trying to make use of narrow networks so we can save costs in the healthcare system throughout. And this is regardless of what the political landscape looks like. At the Oscar board level, all we're concerned about is how do we more effectively get healthcare for our members, and we have to adapt no matter what the politics look like.
So does the regulatory environment change your views of investment at any point?
No, I think it may change tactics of the company, but it doesn't change the strategy, which is the fortunate thing. The fortunate thing is we're building a company that has a fantastic relationship with its members so that we can provide them the best health care possible. Obviously, the regulatory environment will change tactics of the company that we have to use, but it doesn't change the strategy.
So how would Oscar's Health, for example's tactics change?
I mean, if they made it possible to sell health insurance across state lines, we would adapt to that. There's all sorts of things that you have to do. It impacts whether we go into different states, whether we've tried to go for different verticals in the health insurance space. Those things are all taken into account with the policy, but it does not change the long-term strategy of the company.
What about the environment in which we live, not only political and regulatory, but also the pace of change? I'm fascinated every single day by the talk of disruption, about the talk of a universal basic income, the need to help those that are about to potentially lose their jobs, robotics, automation. Are you a technology optimist or pessimist when it comes to this sort of?
Well, I can tell you that I am a world optimist because I don't think it pays to be a world pessimist. And so I'm an optimist on the world, and I'm an optimist on humans' ability to adapt to any situation. Whether or not we go to a universal basic income or whether it's something else, we're going to adapt both as a society and human beings. For instance, I'm extremely bullish on one of our portfolio companies, Airbnb. It's currently involved with homes, but it has a nascent experience platform that I'm extremely bullish on when it comes to Economy 2.0. I mean, the Airbnb experience platform can give people a way to monetize their skills, whatever that may be, in a way that we've never seen before in humanity. So I'm very excited about that over the next decade.
You say that we will adapt as humans, but is it ever the responsibility of technology to help with that adaptation, or is it always a regulatory, political responsibility?
I think we always try and help with that from a technology perspective, but you're not going to be able to artificially stop it. So you have to work with it and adapt with it and have technology do things that are very helpful for society, but humanity has to adapt along with it, and that's what we're doing.
Of course, you've got a lot of PR, dare I say, a lot of eyes on you because of your reputation and the investments you've made, the exits that you've delivered for Founders Fund. How do you feel startups are looking at you at the moment? Because there was some negative reaction to Peter Thiel's, shall we say, controversial and sometimes unconventional viewpoints. Has that changed in any way, how many startups you're able to get in front of you and really how attractive you are as a VC?
Yeah, we're a collection of all individuals. We don't often agree with each other, let alone the rest of Silicon Valley. But we always offer a contrarian viewpoint, and some of the most experienced founders love that. A lot of experienced founders don't just want to be agreed with, they want to be challenged. And we welcome entrepreneurs who want to experience all sorts of different viewpoints and be challenged while maintaining the control that at the end of the day, it's the entrepreneur's decision. If they want to be challenged, they should come talk with us.
Last question for you, geographical in nature.
Yeah.
Who's knocking on your door Is it purely Silicon Valley, US-based startups? Where are you starting to see some of the excitement coming from? Because I'm a Brit, I'm sat here, is this the only hub I should care about, or what about some of the rest of the world?
To be honest, we are seeing, especially at the early stages, we are seeing this come from all over the world at this point, which is very exciting. I actually think it makes a ton of sense to start a company elsewhere. People still may need to come to Silicon Valley to scale. We are fortunate to have a lot of the top tier talent in the world in Silicon Valley, but where you start the company is completely independent. We're seeing some fascinating stuff coming out of Europe right now, coming out of everywhere.
Well, we hopefully will see yet more geographical diversification, and we'll look as to which investments you'll be making going forward. It's been fascinating having you here. Thank you so much for giving of your time.
Thanks for having me.
Ryan Singerman, partner at Founders Fund. Now, a major media deal which is on hold. The UK government delayed its decision on 21st Century Fox's plan to acquire the rest of pay TV provider Sky. That's until after the June the 8th election. The deadline for communications regulator Ofcom to complete its assessment has been pushed to June 20th. Now coming up, Pinterest is trying to set itself apart from the social network it is so often compared to. We'll dig into what's next for this 7-year-old startup. And a quick reminder of our interactive TV function. You can find it at TV Go on the Bloomberg. You'll not only be able to watch us live, but also see previous interviews and dive into any of the securities or Bloomberg functions we feature on the programme. This is for Bloomberg subscribers only, though, I'm afraid. Check it out, TV Go. This is Bloomberg. Now, Walmart's e-commerce chief, Mark Law, reaped an astronomical payday to the tune of $244 million in compensation last year. The payout was fueled by shares of Walmart stock he received as part of the sale of Jet.com, his previous company, to the retail giant. Law's compensation puts him well ahead of his new boss, Walmart CEO Doug McMillon, who received a $22.5 million pay package. You'll recall that retailing giant acquired Jet last year in an effort to bolster its online sales. Now, Pinterest announced that it's retiring the like button on its platform. The move is a step to differentiate itself from social networks like Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. The visual discovery startup will also launch its first major ad campaign. Pinterest is considering advertising on billboards, websites, newspapers, and magazines. Joining us from New York is our guest host for the hour, David Kirkpatrick, CEO of Techonomy. And here with us in the studio, Bloomberg technology reporter Sarah Fryer, who just sat down with the co-founder in a rare interview from this week's Decrypted podcast. I mean, this really was rare. You got to sit down with all the executive team, really, the president and indeed the two co-founders. Tell us what you learned, because this has been quite the silent unicorn almost of the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, you know, contrasting with what we think of as a disruptive Silicon Valley founder, this sort of, you know, sometimes even brash or even a little bit overbearing, these guys are nice. They're just incredibly, like, you know, slow and steady and thoughtful. Not to say that the business is moving slowly. In fact, behind the scenes, they've done quite a lot to update their product. But not a lot of it is stuff that we see on the surface, sort of the flashy product updates that we get from these social media companies. It's more with the algorithm. They want you to think of them as a search company, surfacing ideas that can help you plan your life.
So more of a Google than an Instagram. David, wing a question now to Sarah, because I'm sure you're interested in the subject.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I was listening to the podcast, and, you know, there is a sort of modesty that almost comes across as a modesty of ambition there. So, Sarah, I mean, when you think about it, and they're saying they want to be sort of a Google of imagery or whatever, does that really make sense to you? Do you really think they're going to get there? Are they going to retain their multi-billion-dollar valuation that they've been celebrated for?
I think that they have threats coming up from all sides. I mean, Google just announced that soon you'll be able to see shoppable images in their image search. That is especially Pinteresty. Instagram just announced that you'll be able to save posts that inspire you in collections. That sounds a lot like Pinterest. So, you know, you focus on social media for much of your career too, David. This is a rule of the network, right? The larger network sometimes wins. And the biggest threat to Pinterest right now is that they have 175 million users. That's a healthy amount, but it's not the 600 million of Instagram or, you know, the whole world using Google. It is a threat.
Sarah, I listened to the Decrypted podcast this morning as I was in the gym and loved, what you drew out in particular from some of these executives and actually what they refused to sort of tell you. It doesn't look like it's quite got the stellar growth that we're expecting of many a startup unicorn-based company. They didn't want to say that growth was as fast as this time last year.
Right. They wouldn't answer questions about that as much, and they also wouldn't talk about their eventual IPO. They said, we have no plans. And I said, okay, well, are you talking about it? And they're like, well, we can't say whether we're talking about it, but we have no plans. And so, but if you look at the little pieces that are coming together, I mean, they're hiring a very senior executive team. They're trying to sort of clean up their vision. This whole advertising campaign, even opening up their executives to talk to a reporter like me, all of these things are things you need to do in order to prepare for that eventual public offering.
And certainly he confirmed that they wanted to remain certainly independent. It wasn't like they were looking for a sale in any way. Sarah, I really enjoyed the podcast. I have to say, Decrypted is where it's at when you want to get these sort of insights. I'm just going to ask David, what's your view, therefore, on whether we'll be seeing a Pinterest IPO anytime soon or at that sort of lofty valuation?
I don't know. I think probably the valuation would be the challenge they have with an IPO anytime soon. I will say, among particularly younger women I know, the brand loyalty to Pinterest is very, very real, at least in the United States. So I think they have a strong business. The thing that surprised me most about Sarah's commentary and interviews with them was when they explicitly said they're not a social network. Really surprising.
Yeah, that was a fascinating twist, and certainly trying to be moving in more into AI and computer vision. It's where it's at, but not that many engineers when it comes to it. Thank you very much indeed. Great insight from Bloomberg technology reporter Sarah Fryer. Check out the Decrypted podcast. And David Kirkpatrick, Techonomy CEO and Bloomberg contributor, sticking with us. You can hear more, of course, on this week's Decrypted podcast, available on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Bloomberg at NI Podcast.
I'm Elisa Parenti, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with a check of your first word news. President Trump signed a set of financial services executive orders to review U.S. tax regulations and roll back Dodd-Frank. He spoke just before the signings at the Treasury Department.
We have taken unprecedented action to bring back our jobs and return power to our citizens. It's been taken away. We've lifted one terrible regulation after another at a record clip, from the energy sector to the auto sector, and we have many more to go, and that's going to be happening over the next, I would say, 4 to 5 weeks.
French officials have confirmed Karim Charoufi, the gunman who killed a police officer in Paris last night, was born in the French capital. They also say his car was loaded with weapons. Documents also found next to his body and in his car had messages which suggested support for Islamic State. That group claimed responsibility for the attack. France's prime minister is dismissing criticism from far-right presidential candidate Marine Le Pen in the wake of the attack. Bernard Cazeneuve says the French National Front party leader was exploiting the situation to score political points.
Je veux rappeler à Marine Le Pen qu'en matière de lutte contre...
I want to remind Marine Le Pen that in terms of the fight against terrorism, the fight against terrorism is difficult, that laxity is not firmness, and neither is exaggeration a gauge of efficiency. Marine Le Pen demands the reinforcement of our secret services, but she forgets to remind the French people that her party voted against all the anti-terrorism laws.
Now, Le Pen wants to reinstate border checks and expel foreigners on watch lists. That prime minister says nothing in the investigation links immigration to the shooting. French officials plan to increase security with the first round of the presidential election set for Sunday. 11 candidates are expected to be whittled down to 2 for a winner-takes-all round 2 on May 7th. Tune into Bloomberg at 2 p.m. Sunday Eastern for our special coverage. Venezuelan officials say another person was killed today in a wave of anti-government protests that have been sweeping the capital city of Caracas. That brings the death toll up to at least 9. Demonstrators have been marching against what they call a slide by the Maduro government into authoritarianism and economic collapse. Another protest is planned this weekend. They also plan to block the nation's main roads on Monday. House Speaker Paul Ryan is leading a bipartisan congressional delegation to Warsaw to meet with Poland's president and prime minister following the recent deployment of thousands of U.S. troops there. And in Britain, the Queen, Elizabeth II's 91st birthday was celebrated today with gun salutes as the monarch celebrated quietly at home. The Queen is Britain's longest reigning monarch. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists in more than 120 countries. I'm Elisa Parenti, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Caroline Hyde. Now, earnings season is, of course, underway with tech giants from Netflix to Qualcomm and IBM reporting numbers this week. Joining us now for a deep dive on those earnings, plus other tech headlines that grabbed our attention, Bloomberg Technology Senior Executive Editor Brad Stone. Still with us from New York is my guest co-host for the hour, Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick. Guys, I'm already looking ahead to next week. I'm already thinking of Alphabet, Amazon, Twitter, people we really want to get our teeth into. But what about the earnings season as it thus started? Because IBM fell 5% over the week, Brad. We saw not much movement from Netflix and IBM. Are you feeling there's much anticipation towards this key earnings season?
Yeah, well, next week things really get started, but this week considered a preview. Netflix, very interesting. User growth a little bit below analyst estimates, so the stock kind of wobbled a little bit. Netflix said that they didn't have that big production like a House of Cards this quarter to go and boost membership numbers, but net profits were up. It's interesting. When they don't have a new show, it tends to look more like a tech company, higher margins. When they do have a new show, it looks more like a media company. Investors don't quite know what to make of it. Yeah,
David, it's always interesting watching Netflix, and it seems to be a little bit of an Amazon in its way that it does splurge an awful lot for future revenue, and we're expecting a House of Cards to help bump Q2 for it. But anything key stand out for you in terms of this week's earnings?
Well,
plethora.
The fact that they, a little stumble hurts a lot in a company like that that's valued at $60 billion, which for a media company is a huge valuation. And let's face it, Netflix is basically a conventional media company that happens to have figured out the internet earlier than the others. But basically, the others are figuring out the internet. So in my opinion, long term, you're probably going to see Netflix seen more and more in conjunction with companies like Time Warner and Comcast, Disney, et cetera, than, compared to Facebook or Google, which has sort of been its history up to now.
I mean, you're just talking about its particular valuation when its price to earnings is 187, according to the Bloomberg terminal. That is something to keep an eye on. No wonder it's so sensitive to its numbers and how they come out. Let's flick it on a gear and let's talk about F8, because that's what really captured the imagination here in Silicon Valley, because we heard from Facebook, really the next big bet being augmented reality, Brad, but we also heard about being able to understand words through your skin, being able to have mind reading. What did you think of it?
Well, of course, I'm interested to hear what David thinks about this. But the augmented reality thing, a lot of people couldn't resist making the comparison to Snap, and of course, what it has been doing with augmented reality. I consider it to be the kind of Pokemon Go-ification of the world. Can we bring all these digital wonders to our phones, overlay it with real reality, come up with new solutions? Zuckerberg obviously is insanely competitive. He is going obviously where Snap is. And then with the Building 8 stuff, the skin connectivity, obviously there's a goal there to create a long-term vision that can maybe inspire investors and customers.
And developers who they're sat in front of. David, you're a man who's written the book on Facebook. What did you think of F8?
Well, I guess I have a slightly less cavalier view than Brad, partly because I think with Facebook, I've followed them so long and so closely and seen them do things so many times that people thought they wouldn't be able to do. So number one, on the augmented reality, I think it is the right move for them. I think it's extremely smart that they're talking about that more and virtual reality less, even though they bought Oculus, because I think in the long run, augmented reality is what really solves a lot of their biggest problems. And if you think about this extraordinary letter that Zuckerberg wrote a month or so ago about how he wants to be the community for the world, the reason it's so hard for him to do it is because it's all virtual, and virtual stuff takes us away from the real world. Augmented reality has this potential to blend it all together. I think that's very cool. Building 8, there's some great stuff there too, which I could talk about.
David, do you think Facebook needs, or any tech company needs, the glasses to make augmented reality real? I mean, why do we want to look down at our phones to understand the real world around us? I mean, isn't that why Pokemon Go eventually sort of fizzled out?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Obviously, we don't have the interface for augmented reality. Do I think we will have it? Yes. Do we know what it is? No. Do I want to have a big stupid glasses on my face? No. And I think, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a way for some clever innovator to come up with a new combination of technologies. It happens time and time again. I think it's so clear that augmented reality is what essentially we want and need that I'm just waiting for somebody to invent the interface.
Invent the interface. What we want and need apparently came to a light this week as well, because what we don't need is a $400 juicer that we could actually squeeze the vegetables and fruit out of a pack with our hands, it would seem. This was such a great scoop, Brad. Tell us about what Olivia Zaleski and Ellen Hewitt brought to us.
Yes, let's thank them for squeezing such joy into our lives this week. Basically writing about a very high-profile Silicon Valley company, Juicero. It has raised more than $100 million to create a connected juicer, and what they determined and demonstrated in a nice pithy video is that you can just squeeze these bags of juice and get a quite nice glass of fruit and vegetable juice without the expensive device. And the CEO responded somewhat defensively, and people had a lot of fun with it, perhaps because it reveals a little bit of the ridiculousness of Silicon Valley at its worst, which is it's not really solving problems for regular people. It is coming up with high-priced solutions for a very high-priced lifestyle.
Yeah, David, I mean, these weren't just any venture capitalists, though, that backed this company. I mean, we saw Google Ventures in on the act, KPW. There was a lot of money being spent. Do you think this is a sign of some sort of concern, or just a one-off bad bet?
Oh, I think there is concern. I mean, there's another pretty well-known venture capitalist here in New York, Albert Wenger at Union Square Ventures, wrote a column this week about how, there is something of a top happening in venture capital. I think, there's a lot of money sloshing around, and there aren't that many good investments, partly because most really cool innovations don't require as much money to develop as they used to. And everybody thinks venture capital and tech is where they want to make the big bucks in a time when returns are poor elsewhere. So, but I think this is just a classic case of too much money going to the wrong person. And, these people have now offered their money back to the customers. This is a bad story. They should not have gotten money from these big-time investors.
And a great scoop from Bloomberg. What a place it was. Thank you very much indeed. Of course, Bloomberg Technology Senior Executive Editor Brad Stone across all things for us. And Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick sticking with me. Now, in global news for you, French voters may decide Europe's future this weekend as the presidential election has turned into a four-way race. Investors and pollsters predict pro-Eurocentrist Emmanuel Macron will come out on top on Sunday's first round of voting. Back in January of 2016, we spoke to the then French economy minister, Emmanuel Macron, about the evolving tech scene in the country.
Innovation and creativity are part of the French DNA. But in the past, we didn't convert this energy into business. And I think that the big change is the new generation now is much more pro-business, much more obsessed by creating startups.
And a special programming note for you. Coming up this Sunday on Bloomberg Television and Radio, special coverage of the first round of the French presidential election live from Paris, London and New York. Join Francine Lacroix and David Gura and our Bloomberg news reporters from the campaign events and rallies across France. We'll also have the latest market reaction from London and New York. Now, coming up, after revolutionizing phones, testing self-driving cars and exploring augmented reality, Apple may now be looking towards space. More on that story next. This is Bloomberg. Now, in this edition of Out of This World, Apple may be looking to the skies. The iPhone maker has recruited a pair of top Google satellite executives for a new hardware team. That's according to people familiar with the matter, who say it could be a potential move by the tech giant into the field of satellite design and operation. Now, big tech companies are looking to connect billions of people said to be without internet access, in part by providing broadband access through satellites in low Earth orbit. Joining us now to discuss Bloomberg Technology's Mark Gurman, and still with us from New York, it's my guest co-host for the hour, David Kirkpatrick. Mark, great story that you and Mark Bergen also worked together on, because what is really the desire here? Is it all about satellites for Apple now?
Absolutely. Apple is looking into all sorts of new areas. Like you said, AR, cars, we covered all of this. Now we're jumping into a new space that we're going to focus some attention on. Yeah, that's right. That's right. The sky, space, whatever you want to call it. So Apple hired two of the world's top leading experts in satellite hardware technologies, John Fenwick and Mike Trella, both from Google. They worked at a company called Skybox earlier, and they produce satellites as well. So we're not 100% clear on what Apple is going to be doing in the space, but now they have a hardware team with two of the best in that space. So we'll see in the near term and in the long term what they're up to.
David, get in here.
Well, I mean, when you hired Gurman, they called him a scoop machine. This guy just keeps turning out amazing stories about Apple. But I have to say, I think it makes sense. And here's why. You know, Apple's got this extraordinary valuation, this extraordinary resource of capital, et cetera. But they're basically a rich people's product company, right? The real growth opportunity to make them go to the moon even further from where they are is if they can go global and really get everybody, or make it possible for literally anyone to buy an Apple product, which is really not true in most countries. This is the way they could do it. If they could provide satellite internet access, as Mark's story says, you know, at a speed comparable to what we have with cellular, my gosh, that's just a huge thing. And then they could sell special devices for people in, you know, Botswana that would use that, and those people will buy it.
Right, to your point, David, the applications here are enormous. They can put internet around the world. They could also use it for their self-driving car efforts. If they need something to control the cars, they need to send information down to AR glasses. They can do that from satellites too. Being in the satellite business is critical for any technology company, but especially Apple, because they're trying to play in so many different fields. And another cool thing would be if they're just, you know, wanting to develop drones or other stuff to actually send people high in the air or take pictures from the air. You know, that would be cool. I'm sure, David, you would want to be one of the first to get into an Apple satellite and go into space.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I love the idea of using it for their car business, which doesn't exist, and maybe you'll tell us about that next week. But, you know, don't you think in the end that growth in the developing world has got to be one of their top priorities?
Absolutely, and part of what's holding back iPhone penetration in some of these smaller regions, these other countries, is that they don't have the penetration of LTE and these faster networks that the iPhones really take advantage of and almost need to function. So if Apple could speed that up, they could do two things here. One, they can get people to buy more hardware in those countries. Two, they can start replacing some of these carriers and other networks around the world. As we know, Apple always likes to add more of itself into its products. We saw that with chips. We saw that with them taking over new graphics processors recently. We see them doing more for the car, AR. Going after providing internet and wireless networking in the future is definitely on their list. They're looking at everything and anything to take over the world.
Wow. So telecoms, look out. What about an interesting team up potentially with Boeing? You reported on that. Can you explain as to whether this might be a joint venture we see?
Well, this is part of their, attempt to look at new businesses. Apple has so much cash, and they were definitely in talks with Boeing about Boeing's new internet broadcasting system through these constellation, as they call it, of satellites. If it doesn't work out for Apple internally to build their own, maybe it'll work out for them funding. They like to look at other companies before they, jump into those spaces. For example, Apple and Didi, their partnership, Apple gave them $1 billion to grow across Asia. Mm-hmm. And now Apple's looking at self-driving car technology of their own. Could be a similar approach if they end up investing in Boeing's business, taking a look at it, getting some skin in the game, and then jumping in with their own technology in the future. And I don't want to mince words. To be clear, we're not 100% sure what Apple's going to be doing with this new hardware team, but we do know it's a new hardware team led by Greg Duffy, who co-founded the camera company Dropcam before going to Nest, and now they have two of the world's leading satellite experts. So they're definitely going to be cooking up something, and that'll become clearer in the future.
David, most valuable company in the world, do these sorts of growth potentials mean that it remains as such?
Well, there have been a number of good arguments recently why Apple can still grow from where it is, and I have historically been a little skeptical about that, but I'm starting to change my tune and think that really maybe Apple still has moon to go towards. I just looked up, Boeing's market cap. Apple could buy Boeing and still have in cash and still have half of its cash left over. I mean, this company's got amazing opportunities.
And to add to that, and just one of the most amazing things that I've discovered over the course of reporting on the company for so many years, David and Caroline, when they're developing new products, they don't really take that many resources from other teams. They build up these teams. We had a whole story on this AR team, a bunch of outside hires. The Apple Watch, tons of outside hires. The Apple Car, and now the space exploration. So they're just adding and adding into this empire of different technology categories.
Fascinating. Where else can it go? Bloomberg Technology's Mark Gurman. We know that he'll be here and he'll be breaking it all for you. And Techonomy CEO David Kirkpatrick, brilliant to have you with me on this Friday. We wish you a wonderful weekend. Now, Snap has reportedly signed a deal to get its hands on a patent for geofilters, which are photo filters based on location. Now, the parent company of Snapchat obtained the patent for a whopping $7.7 million from Mobley, an Instagram rival that launched in 2011. This according to TechCrunch. Now, according to Snap's S1 filing for its IPO, of the $400 million in revenues the company has, $360 million is made by selling geofilters to advertisers. So the purchase could also give the company leverage against competitors such as Facebook, who has incorporated similar features of late. Now, coming up, more than 1 billion people are expected to participate in Earth Day events on Saturday. We'll explore how one of the biggest tech companies on the planet is pushing its own green agenda. This is Bloomberg. Ricoh, a maker of printers and copiers, has joined companies such as Apple and Google in pledging to get all its power from renewable sources. But the process will be slow. The Tokyo-based company announced clean energy will supply 30% of the electricity it uses at its offices and factories by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And ahead of all-important Earth Day, Apple has released a new report detailing the company's initiatives to become more sustainable. Apple is now powering 96% of its operations with renewable energy and is thinking outside the box to keep this initiative going. It also recently purchased more than 300,000 acres of forest, helping to reach its goal of protecting enough sustainably managed forests to cover all its packaging needs. So earlier this month, Apple's VP of Environment, Lisa Jackson, spoke to Bloomberg's David Gura about the company's carbon footprint and the China Forest Project.
For Apple itself, I think we looked at it and said our carbon footprint is 38, million metric tons a year. That's more than some small countries. It's, if you look at it in the world's average, it's less than 0.1% a day of what the world does. And so one of the things we also say is you can't change the world and deal with climate change if all you do is make yourself green. And so we have to, Apple's about innovation. Apple's about being the first to something. So when we find something, now the idea is, how can we help our suppliers get green? How can we help our customers feel good about the clean energy that they may be able to access and that we're accessing on their behalf for stuff like FaceTime or when you, send an iMessage, knowing that that's running through a data center that's running on clean energy. You're part of it.
Let me close just by asking you for your message to companies thinking about doing things differently, thinking about moonshots, as they're often called in Silicon Valley or in tech. I know that Apple has a forest in China. That strikes me as something that must have been an off-the-wall idea at first. Give me an update on why you have that forest there, what the status of that is, if we could see something like that elsewhere. And then, more broadly speaking, how you agitate for change like that within a company like Apple.
The forest came from a conversation with a group of women. We went out, leaders at Apple, I was sort of get to know Lisa Jackson, and one of the women said, why don't we just buy a forest? We use all this wood pulp to make paper for our packaging. And, Apple packaging is gorgeous. We want it to be sustainably sourced material. And I was like, that's when I knew I was somewhere new, because that kind of innovation, that kind of moonshot idea is so classic of Silicon Valley, which is to go back to first principles and ask a really basic question and then ideate around it, is what gets me up every morning, because I get to do it for things I really am passionate about, like the environment. And that evolved into finding a partner. In China, it's WWF, World Wildlife Fund. Here in the US, we also do it with the Conservation Fund. And they are, purchasing, protecting working forests in this country on the East Coast and then in China, and setting that land aside to be worked and managed sustainably. So we can now say, as of this year, because of the project in China, it's about to be certified, 320,000 acres, and we're covering our paper footprint with the forests that we've already set aside. And they'll always be working forests, which means people have jobs, but you also have the environmental protection of a beautiful place and a landscape really important for clean air and clean water and climate change. So it's great. And what I say to other companies? There's so many companies who are in this space, companies that may not, always talk about it. And I'm it's pretty inspiring. But I would say the moonshots are really important. The thing that inspires the folks at Apple will inspire everyone, which is don't pick an incremental goal. Pick something really big and hairy and interesting, a hairy idea, and let folks work on that while you're getting everything else in order. Certainly do what you have to do, but you know, what we can do as businesses is find solutions that make you just go, oh, it used to be impossible, and now it's just the way we do business.
That was Apple's VP of Environment, Lisa Jackson. Now that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We have a great lineup of guests next week. Starting Monday, T-Mobile CEO John Legere on company's earnings results. You do not want to miss it. Stock rallying 60% over the last year. Check it out. This is Bloomberg.